Everyone. Welcome to Dodge Poetry's reading and conversation entitled The Healing Power of Poetry. I'm Isabel Gonzalez, producer for Poetry and Social Impact here at NJPAC and Dodge Poetry, and you're joining us for a very special evening, The Healing Power of Poetry. Words carry weight and meaning. They can also be a salve for trauma and pain. Experience the healing power of poetry. Tonight will be an unforgettable reading and conversation. Literary giants Reginald Dwayne Betts, Kimberly Blazer, and Carl Phillips will explore poetry as a radical tool for wellness and collective care. These thoughtful poets will share their perspectives on how writing can foster solace and restoration. Some themes that will be explored include poetry's role in accelerating emotional healing. How does the transcendence of language impact a reader and writer's well being? I'll read some brief bios of the artists so you have an idea of what's in store for us over the next hour. We'll start with Reginald Dwayne Betts, who is a poet, lawyer, founder, and CEO of Freedom Reads, the only organization in the country with a mission to open libraries in adult and youth prisons. So far, more than 500 Freedom libraries have been opened in 13 states. Betts is also the author of a memoir and 5 collections of poetry. He's a MacArthur Fellow and has been awarded fellowships from Harvard's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study, the National Endowment of the Arts, Emerson Collective, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Next, who we'll be reading is Kimberly Blazer, who is an enrolled member of the White Earth Nation and is an Anishinaabe activist and environmentalist. She is also the founding director of Indigenous Nations Poets, or INAPO, and an MFA faculty member at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She is also a former Wisconsin Poet Laureate and has published 6 poetry collections and received numerous awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from Native Writers Circle of the Americas. Her debut collection of fiction, Red Ants, will be published this fall. And finally, Carl Phillips, who is a writer of prose and poetry who has received numerous awards, including a 2023 Pulitzer Prize for his poetry collection, Then the War, and selected poems 2007 through 2020. Other honors include the Jackson Poetry Prize, the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, the Aiken Taylor Award for Modern American Poetry, and awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Academy of American Poets, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Library of Congress. His latest book of poems is Scattered Snows to the North. After each poet reads, they will be all joined on screen for an inspiring conversation. And tonight's event is part of year-round programming funded generously by the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation. And I'm very excited to say that we're starting to gear up for our 2026 Dodge Poetry Festival, and we'll be opening applications for readers at the end of this month. So please don't miss your opportunity to submit your work then. And if you'd like to stay current on all things Dodge Poetry, please join our mailing list by visiting njpac.org/Dodge Poetry. And I just really want to thank you for joining us. And I hope you enjoy this evening, the showcase of powerful poetry. And I'd like to now welcome to the screen Reginald Dwayne Betts.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining. It's a real honor actually to be here because we had these conversations and we say these things, and usually we have them in the context of having been fully well for a long time or having not confronted the need to have poetry save us. I think the joy that we get from poetry is often what brought us to poetry, but it's not the thing that carries us through the days. And I had a really horrible, tough, challenging few years, even while doing the joyous work of Freedom Reads. And, you know, I kept Carl's books with me, and not just these two, but I kept a lot of them. And I found myself going to them, and I realized that in ways I hadn't known before, the poems gave me real joy, and it was not just in the play on language and the play on words and the really interesting and singular syntactical arrangements of words against each other, but it really about what it made me think about. And ultimately, I think you can write a poem that makes somebody imagine a position where they would be in the future and not just where they might have been in the past. So I'm gonna read 4 poems from my book Doggerel, which is the most joyous book I've ever written, even down to the cover. On joy. You asked me how I'm doing, and I realized there are not enough words for joy in the English language, not like in German, where man can whisper a phrase for relief that roughly translates to "it felt like a stone falling from my heart." The gods must not know the things I've wanted in this world. In prison, a letter is called the kite, as if words alone can gift the man wings. And I want to tell you that my body is a kite swept into the wind. To say some days my heart is the wildest, hungriest thing I know. Whatever about choices. Follow me now, the erratic thing that knocks against my rib cage says, and I have. Everywhere. Of cliffs and cities whose names I cannot pronounce. Back into prisons. To walking Alec, a Jack Russell Terrier, in a park with Debbie. To my son's basketball games, to weeping and to down on my knees. To something I've never actually called joy, but just might be. That remembering of all the things I believe needed letting go, only to learn the raft on which I ride into my todays was built with them. 10 minutes, I think I could fully get 4 poems, so I am going to read a couple more. This one is called Grief, but I've just decided to read one extra one because it has a curse word in it, and I have to curse because it's after 6 o'clock, and that's a prerequisite for joy. Actually, my therapist says cursing is akin to meditation if you do it right. Grief for Lori. The story of Easy, a small dog who I imagine is named after Mosley's detective, crawls into the space left by Zinnia, burrowing in the corners against door frames beneath a house, in search of a phantom smell. State Fair, Sahara, Thumbelina, Dreamland, Envy, Orange Star, creeping zinnias that bloom into frost. My God, the ways we grieve again and again, because the only rule of life is to forget means to abandon. When I forget to feed Tay, she never barks, but waits wherever I am, as if she trusts my memory more than I do. I imagine this is grief's lesson. It is the engine of making what happened before matter, and it's true that I've only ever remembered a few joys as much as I've recounted all the reasons to grieve. But nothing grows without weeping, not even joy. I ain't gonna lie, reading poems with 3 people is like speed dating. And so I am both delighted to do this, and I feel like I'm talking too fast. So I'm glad this is being recorded. So if you care to, you can listen to this again. 2 more poems. Canary. I'll just say I'm reading this one because this poem ended with before. It said, a lover once showed me that everyone deserves to be disappointed. And I was writing these poems for a friend of mine that was going through colorectal cancer. And on revision, I thought, I've learned a lot of things from friends and from lovers. And it's not just that we deserve to be disappointed. And I realized right from somebody who's going through something serious that I get to fucking choose what I say. And I don't have to wallow in the worst of it. I could say something different. And so when I revised it, I made this poem say something different. And I should read it now. Canary, sitting still on a street with a name I cannot recall, is a coupe de ville. I always wanted to sing, seduce a crowd with the terrible in my voice. In mornings, driving by this song of my past, often I slow as if to see is the climb behind the wheel. It returned to the moment that could have changed it all. I sweated that ride like I worried over finding my falsetto, even after Ahmad let me know to reach those notes. A man essentially cuts his own throat. Something about desire frightens me. I started to love that canary spaceship and then discovered DeVille is a French word for town hall. Maybe some don't need an audience. I didn't expect to land here, where I tell you there is no city for me to claim. Admit I've learned to belong and what meaning comes from this Cadillac that never moves, but reminds me of times when all my baggage was expectation. A lover once showed me how everyone deserves to expect tenderness. And I drive by that version of my yesterdays and know that there is always something to cherish so much it makes you sigh, as some longing might. I'm gonna try to squeeze two more in. Cafe Sicario. Simone walks up to me and this place becomes another kind of home. How to admit this? In every city I love, I've been a stranger. How to say I love how on my walk here I wait for Lassie, two of them, white and eager to bark as I pass their home. I have become someone who welcomes the loud bark of a dog that would have frightened me late into my 30s. Taz may be the same breed as the pair that says hello, and I know he is large enough to tumble me to the ground and play. And I'm still unafraid. Even if I'd be surprised just as now when an Italian who offered me a ride on a lonely night, when three of us with languages bridging colonialism were stranded in this strange city, calls out Reginald as he approaches this cafe I've sat at 4 consecutive days. And realizing every place I've known, I've collected names as souvenirs. Shahid, Reggie, Young Music, Jojo Santana, all a way for people to do as Simone does now. Offer me welcome as a way to say kindness makes us no longer strangers. And then he offers to show me his city where I would be a stranger still, but less so because of friendship he extends to a man who has only now learned to weep. Last poem. Of all this, only thing you need to know is Happy Homes is one of those puppy daycares that I used to take my Jack Russell to. Of all this, and it all reminds me of the small dog that walks with me, mostly barking. And of days I drive her to Happy Homes where she bored and riot with the local cacophony. And it reminds me of how, as we pull up, before the car full stop, she be on two paws, full leaning, her mouth against the glass as she shouted her joy. And maybe I shouldn't be surprised when she bounds from my car and barely pauses before launching herself and me toward the green door, for behind which those who have become her pack wait. But I am always surprised and astonished, too, that she can leap into my arms and leap away and have entirely no clue how sometimes you want, in a way that's familiar from one continent to another, to the fowl and wind and flowers and even the gravel that people carrying a stone in their heart have walked upon. That feeling for a moment, for at least a second, if that, to just fucking howl. Thank you.
That was really amazing. I'm so grateful to hear those words in light of everything that's been happening this week. Uju Nindinue Maganado, Uju Niji Kwewag. Hello, my relatives. Hello, my friends. I'm Kim Blazer, and I'm from the White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota. So the heartache in Minneapolis is very personal for me. And I believe that this evening is going to be great for all of us to be able to remember how poetry can offer us hope and healing. And I'm reading primarily from Ancient Light, which is my most recent book. And in fact, one of my answers to where do we find hope and where do we find healing is Ancient Light. And I draw a bit on Indigenous teachings and so forth. And I'll also be reading from Copper Yearning, which came a couple of books ago. I want to start out with an excerpt from the prelude in Ancient Light, because it is actually answering that question for me and sort of creating a space for the poems in that volume. Akawe, a prelude. Between languages, in the shadow of old losses, we adorn ourselves. Everywhere careful words break open, they feed us. Remembrance like bread. Poetry names the shattered, shifts gravity. Call it map, duende, or zaga iri win. Each home language a literacy, a blessing we inhabit. From our tongues, a salve, an animal's saliva called language. Mikwendam, retelling we wake, seek repair, tethered to moon by ritual, desire, Panay, this way we continue. And in a time of resistance, we have to not lose our own sense of community and care. And so this next poem is a poem that I wrote several years ago when there was this confrontation on the mall in BC. If you remember, there was an Indigenous man who was drumming and he was confronted by MAGA-wearing youth. And it was what he did in that moment that inspired this poem, which was simply to not confront and remain centered on the dignity of gestures. For Nathan Phillips. 1. Remember hands ungloved and notched by life. Watch them pour stovetop coffee into tin cups, lift cross poles onto fence butts, mend nets, rock your children. 2. Pay homage and speak the names of sweepers and shovelers, canners, cafeteria cooks, baby doctors, and deathbed watchers. Esme, Dale, Margaret, David, Mike, and Colleen. 3. Receive all gifts, crocheted Afghan or prize money, with humility. Gratitude spreads easy as butter. Unworthiness endures. 4. Watch the eyes of turtle. Admire the neck courting of swans. Study wing beats and tail rhythms. Note how otter sows stoop to lift pups. Listen to wind in fall, to trees bending and unbroken. Announce like spring frogs the unfolding of each holy year. Carry candles into cathedrals, poetry into prisons. 5. Do not become beast in the fray. Remember the indigenous hands that drummed on, the man who stood calm. Another, I feel like, healing aspect of poetry is that it builds connections. And this is a very slight poem that was actually written for a youth audience about standing in kinship. We all have the same little bones in our foot, 26 with funny names like navicular. Together, they build something strong, our foot arch, a pyramid holding us up. These bones don't get casts when they break. We tape them, one phalange to its neighbor for support. Other things, like sorrow, work that way too. Find healing in the leaning, in the closeness. Our feet have 1/4 of all the bones in our body. Maybe we should give more honor to feet and to all the tiny but blessed cogs in the world, communities, the forgotten architecture of friendship. And throughout Ancient Light, there are a group of poems coming out of a certain kind of aesthetic. And they're all called The Way We Love Something Small. And they are about poetry as an act of attention and how that attention to the world can indeed bring us peace and healing. So I'll just read one of those. The Way We Love Something Small. Inky leaf shadows on snow. Each animal track a hollow, trace of bird feet, double oval of deer, the glyphs we make, the ones we follow. And then this is a poem from Copper Yearning, which is actually written after Michael Blumenthal's What I Believe. And I think that I'm thinking again about seeing the world, but then falling into the world more deeply. And that experience itself is part of where I find hope and healing. What I believe. I believe the weave of cotton will support my father's knees, but no indulgences will change hands. I believe nothing folds easily, but that time will crease, retrain the mind. I believe in the arrowheads of words, and I believe in silence. I believe the rattle of birch leaves can shake sorrow from my bones, but that we all become bare at our own pace. I believe the songs of childhood follow us into the kettles of age, but the echoes will not disturb the land. I believe the reach of the kayak paddle can part the blue corridor of aloneness, and that the eyes we see in the water are never our own. And then this is a poem that I think recognizes the cost of colonization and all that colonization continues to bring us, and yet finds in the fact that we persist and resist in the kind of survivance that Visner talks about, some hope. Mazanaguaso florets. When I embroider flowers, I inhale. Remember again each petal deep pocket, each blossom like a tiny hand lifted. Mishkoko read the dress of other murdered. My fingers hunger, stitches, callous tips, and offering to florals and woodland spirits who have curved our bodies in season, centers a holy that open, damp with nectar, wanton our bloom, wanton our disappearance, Equewug, women wild and heedless as flora, in a world innocent of scythe and pesticide, innocent of trampling oil nations who own. Wabiguanika, an abundance we make of the broken when burst becomes seed. And then I wanted to close with this poem because I feel like we've been living through loss on top of loss. And sometimes we go to poetry to ask, of ourselves and maybe to offer to others how we survive, how we find hope. And this is a particular poem that I also want to offer for Renee Good. Afterwards, because the smallness of our being is our only greatness, because one night I was in a room listening until only one heart beat, because in these last years I've worn and nearly worn out my black funeral shoes, because the gesture of afterwards means the same thing no matter who speaks them, because faith, belief, forever are only words, no matter, because matter disappears always and eventually, because action is not matter, but energy that's spent changes being. And if death, too, is a change of being, perhaps action counts. And if death is a land of unknowing, perhaps we do well to live with uncertainty. And if death is a forested land, it would be good to learn trees. And if death is a kingdom, it would be good to practice service. And if death is a foreign state, we should loosen allegiance to this one. And if our soul leaves our body, then we must rehearse goodbye. Chi-miigwech.
Hello. Thank you, Kimberly and Dwayne, for those very powerful readings. I'm Carl Phillips, and I'm very honored to be part of this evening of poetry and healing. I'm going to read poems actually from my very first book, in part because it's being reissued after 30 some years next month or in March. Um, and so that seemed a good reason to revisit it, but also because when I was thinking about the themes for this panel, I realized this book was written as an alternative, at the risk of seeming overly dramatic, to suicide. It was a time when I had not understood my queerness and was wrestling with something I didn't know I was wrestling with exactly. And then when I understood what it was, it seemed an impossible situation. I was married at the time to a woman who had been my best friend in college, and I was very confused. And the poems suddenly started coming out of nowhere. And I realize now that they were a form of therapy, which we're not supposed to say about poetry, I'm told. But I've always felt that poetry sort of saves me daily, the writing of it and the reading of it. So I'm going to read some poems from there. And then we'll have a conversation. I'm going to set my little alarm thing here, timer. All right. So this is the poem. Well, the book is called In the Blood. Um, And what you'll see is, besides wrestling with queerness, I also was trying to make sense of my biracial identity and figuring out I how I fit in particular with blackness, which seemed to me very narrowly defined by a lot of people, and I wanted to sort of shift the definition. Okay, this poem is called X. It's the poem the book opens with. Several hours past that of knife and fork laid across one another to say done. X is still for the loose stitch of beginners, the newlywed grinding next door that says no one but you, the pucker of lips only, not yet the wounds those lips may be drawn to. X, as in variable, anyone's body, any set of conditions. Your body scaling whatever fence of chain metal X's desire throws up, what your spread-eagled limbs suggest, falling, and now, after. X, not just for where in my life you've landed, but here too, where your ass begins its half-shy, half-weary dividing, where I sometimes lay my head like a flower and think I mean something by it. X is all I keep meaning to cross out. All right. This poem is called Passing. I haven't read from this book in 35 years or something. I just realized I'm terrified. Okay, this is called Passing. When the famous Black poet speaks, I understand that his is the same unnervingly slow, rambling method of getting from A to B that I hated in my father who always told me, don't shuffle. The famous Black poet is speaking of the dark river in the mind that runs thick with the heroes of color, Jackie R., Bessie, Billy, Mr. Page, anyone who knew how to sing or when to run. I think of my grandmother, said to have dropped dead from the evil eye, of my lesbian aunt who saw cancer and a generally difficult future headed her way in the still water of her brother's commode. I think of voodoo in the bottoms of soup cans, and I want to tell the poet that the blues is not my name, that Alabama is something I cannot use in my business. He is so like my father. I don't ask the famous Black poet afterwards to remove his shoes, knowing the inexplicable black and pink I will find there, a cut gone wrong in 5 places. I don't ask him to remove his pants, since that too is known, what has never known a blade, all the spaces between where we differ. I have spent years tugging between my legs and proved nothing really. I wake to the sheets I kicked aside and examine where they failed to mend their own creases, resembling some silken obstruction, something pulled from my father's chest, a bad heart, a lung, the lung of the famous Black poet, saying nothing I want to understand. All right. Um, at the time of writing these poems, I was a high school Latin teacher, and I taught a lot of mythology to high school kids. And mythology for a while was a place I would go to make sense of a lot of experiences, just as mythology itself sort of comes out of explaining things that aren't otherwise explainable to the people at that time. So this is called Leda after the Swan, and it's based on this myth. Leda was a woman who was minding her own business and then suddenly was raped by the god Zeus in the form of a swan. Something that has been made in visual art and sculpture into something that's sort of romanticized and beautiful. But it troubled me because it's a story of a rape. So I wrote this thinking I'm going to change that. But I realized later it was also a way for me to speak about something I had not been able to speak about before, which was my own rape. Leda after the Swan. Perhaps in the exaggerated grace of his weight settling, the wings raised, held in strike or embrace position, I recognized something more than swan, I can't say. There was just this barely defined shoulder whose feathers came away in my hands, and the bit of world left beyond it, coming down to the heat-crippled field. Ravens the precise color of sorrow and good light, neither black nor blue, like fallen stitches upon it. And the hour forever it seemed half-stepping its way elsewhere. Then everything, I remember, began happening more quickly. Um, all right. This next poem is Undressing for Li Po. Li Po was a Tang Dynasty Chinese poet, so around the 700s, 800s AD. Um, and there are a lot of myths about him. One is that he drowned by trying to embrace his own reflection while he was in a boat at night, drunk. Another is that he drank a lot. That may not have been a myth. And another is that he was very tall, maybe 7 feet tall. He also comes from a culture, a poetry culture, where a lot of communication was through poems. People would write poems to each other and back and forth, and do sort of circles of group poems. So there's a lot of communal aspect to poetry. They're almost like letters. Anyway, he's a poet whom I'm very influenced by, and this is a kind of imagined letter to him, I suppose. Undressing for Li Po. Li Po, the moon through the vertical blinds is laying its bars down. I see black tapered lives, and the paler ones in between, all the sticks of my life left to mend. Fingering the two flat prayers at my chest, one pierced with a gold ring, the other rouged with a broken wedge of mouth paint. I'm remembering your fondness for wine, Li Po, you desiring your own reflection or the moon's, the same thing, and dying from it. At the mirror, to the man I love too much, I am trying to say that I have no need for his tattooed body, his hands at my wrists, the cicatrix of woes tilting down from beneath the belly, that I'm tired of flesh tumbling over the dwindling sword of itself, something like joy. Li Po, Li Po. The moon is picking its way over used swabs and razors, pots of cream, my face where I left it on the dressing table. I am thinking mountains, good wine, plash of exile, letters to nowhere, the poems, trimmed affection, distance, boats coming more still than the water in their wandering. Li Po, last night, drunk again, I stood naked downstairs, just dancing, dancing. I watched my feet recover and lose again their apricot, moving in and out from the moon's light. Watched my body lose all particulars save clean grace, what I'd forgotten. I imagined dancing with a man 7 feet tall, the moon making a small planet of his face. I thought of you again, Li Po. And I'm going to finish with this poem called Blue, um, which addresses the topic I raised earlier about being biracial, my white mother, my black father. They both feature here. And then they never appear again in any of my poems. Uh, Blue. As through marble or the lining of certain fish split open and scooped clean. This is the blue vein that rides where the flesh is even whiter than the rest of her, the splayed thighs mother forgets, busy struggling for command over bones, her own, those of the chaise lounge, all equally uncooperative. And there's the wind, too. This is her hair, gone from white to blue in the air. This is the black, shot with blue, of my dark daddy's knuckles, that do not change ever, which is to say they are no more pale in anger than at rest, or when, as I imagine them now, they follow the same two fingers he has always used to make the rim of every empty blue glass in the house sing. Always the same blue to black sorrow, no black surface can entirely hide. Under the night, somewhere between the white that is nothing so much as blue, and the black that is finally nothing, I am the man neither of you remembers, shielding in the half dark the blue eyes I sometimes forget I don't have, pulling my own stoop-shouldered kind of blues across paper, apparently misinformed about the rumored stuff of dreams. Everywhere I inquired, I was told, look for blue. Thank you. Let's have a conversation. Everyone has to come back now. Here they are.
We said we're gonna do it spontaneously, so I'm a
Yes.
spontaneous. Kimberly, that was dope. I hadn't heard you before. That was really interesting hearing you read and listening to you, particularly because I didn't know how many bones were in the foot. Um, and then Carl, yo, what does it feel like though? This book 35 years old? Like, what does it
Apparently,
I mean,
I'm
first,
not, but the book is.
look, I just turned 42 yesterday. Um,
Happy birthday.
I lied about that. That's not even true.
Oh, I thought it
But
might be true.
I'm terrified of I'm scared of reading from my first book, and that sounded fresh. I wonder what it felt like to read from that book, and if it felt, to strike the same kind of healing thing that you was feeling when you first wrote it.
Well, you know, I was thinking about this. I was reading it, and I felt very scared, and I thought, if anything, to tie it in with the theme of this evening, I think that it reminds me how trouble I was and how I'm sure there were resources, but back then there wasn't the internet, wasn't everything, you couldn't just reach out and everything. And I wasn't the kind of person, I guess, whatever that is. I didn't think to go to a therapist, or didn't have money and thought you probably had to pay a lot. I don't know. Um, and so it's weird to think about how many people are struggling with all kinds of things and don't have an outlet. And I do feel as if poetry, I mean, yes, it's a vehicle for spreading joy, but most often I get at readings people saying that and they'll relate to some poem. You were mentioning this before we came on, Dwayne, that um, I'll read some poem that isn't even about what their experience has been, but it resonates in some way. Um, so, it could be, for example, it could be about a dog dying, but for them, they don't have a dog or a cat, but they've known loss of some kind, or they're reckoning with their own mortality. So, yeah, I think poetry is useful for that. And it's not as if, I mean, I remember thinking after finishing the book, I thought, well, now I've solved all those problems. Will I ever write again? Little did I know that, of course, there's always the next day. You're still going to be just as messed up. So then you write some more poems and read some more.
Yeah, I think about the way that, poetry is also music, and we
Yeah.
all like music for different reasons, and it helps us in different ways. And also for me, I think because Indigenous poetry arises partly out of chant and ceremony, as part of its origin. So there's still that incantatory reality that it is also, in my mind, it's medicine. Like the words are medicine. And so in that way, they can be healing. So yeah, I think that there's many ways that people can connect to poetry that we don't expect. But we've found, I think the three of us have found that it helped us. Like it helps us find that joy or that healing. And if you think of what happened this week, how many people posted poems in the light of the murder in Minneapolis?
Wow.
Why? Because that poetry can help them. Yeah, I think it's just, it's a universal need to both, search for and try to find um, some solace or healing, but also I think to make a connection with other people through that.
I like what you said about because I noticed this in your own poems, Kim, the chanting aspect and the repetitions, and I do find that kind of ritualistic repetition calming, but also it reminds me of, we think of poems often as vessels, containers for our feelings, but there's also a long tradition of poems as a spell, as a kind of way of,
Yes.
you know, turning something, turning luck around. And that seems related to what you're saying, the incantatory nature of it. And also because of the repetition, sort of like in church a lot of times, it is a way of bringing community together. I mean, we may not know all the words to the song, but everyone knows the chorus, or the repeating line, and it brings us in unison together, with whoever else is doing the rest of the poem. So,
This I think is, but that's also why I think it's dope when so for this book, I
mhm.
just say, I'm gonna read poems to people in public. And I thought what was really interesting is again, by taking on the challenge of just reading to people who were strangers, just reading on the street. And I'm not saying everybody should do this, but by doing that, one of the things that happened to me is I felt like I was creating a chorus. I felt like I was creating a constant community of people who I was asking, does this poem matter to you? And the state fundamentally changed. Sometimes I would feel the poem differently because I was just reading it to another human being one on one. Another thing is, I got to hold on to the idea that a poem can have a bar in it, and they don't have to get the whole poem. But if they get one line, and when you
Yeah.
talk to somebody, they're now listening to you. And I'm talking about, I read a poem to a woman in Kalamazoo at like 5 o'clock in the morning because she was walking her dog. I was like, "Oh, you got a dog? I love dogs. Let me read you this poem." It's 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm a bald-headed black dude. And because I said the word poem, I said poem and dog, and you have to say both. If you just say one, you might be in trouble. I said poem and dog, and she said, let me hear it. And I read it, and she was like, damn. And this is like 5 o'clock in the morning in Kalamazoo, and the woman had no fear of me, and she literally listened. And when she saw me the next day, she said, oh man, I told my husband that somebody read me a poem at 5 o'clock in the morning. And he was like, do I need to start going out with you at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah. And I
Well,
think the other thing about what, helps people to be pulled into poetry is that it's not only about what we say, but it's the gesture of basically the ineffable, what's unsayable. Like we all come to the edge of that, not having words. And we pretend we have the words when we're writing as poets, but a lot of times what we really do is just simply open it up to what's impossible to actually say in language, but that the poem can gesture towards, you know?
yeah, I agree. And it's a kind of vulnerability. Um, and and maybe that's another way in which it's healing by bringing people together because we all have vulnerability and they may not be the same ones, but and we're all facing there's a lot of big ineffables that we all face, mortality being one of the main ones. A lot of the craziness going on around us now. And it's yeah, and see, I was right before this reading, I was talking to my partner and saying how it's so easy to feel absolutely helpless. And but there's something grounding in poetry because sometimes I'll sit there and think, what am I thinking about poetry right now in a time like this? And I think, it's actually in its own way very necessary.
And I'll just say, man, I think about these times, and honestly, I just got a phone call before we started this, and it was from somebody that's in prison, and they've been locked up for 27 years. And I'll be real, I distance myself from the television and so many things these days because, like, my concerns that brought me to poetry, that brought me to try to understand this world, talking about Etheridge Knight and incarceration of my friends, those have
Mhm.
been persistent for my entire life. And what I recognize in poetry is poetry allows something to always be of the moment. See, when you look at the news, the news doesn't even care about people in prison anymore. I mean, the news is always going to be focused on some particular snapshot of things, and today's traumas and tragedies will get washed away as if they never even mattered 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And so it's like if you go to what's going on television and tell you what matters, you will consistently fail because nobody is talking about people in prison right now, and nobody is talking about like the oil pipelines, things that like dominated the television like just 3 years ago, 4 years ago, as if those problems have disappeared. And it's like it didn't disappear. And
Mhm.
it has never left. It has never left the actual poems. It's never left the work that people were creating because they needed to. And so I think that is like fundamentally profoundly true.
Yeah.
And we're going to do this every week from now on. This has been amazing.
I'm in.
I like that idea.
So I wonder though, and this is one of the things I'm afraid of too, because sometimes when you talk to somebody, just regular person on the street, I don't think that my poems are necessarily all joyous, but I think that they have a different intentionality to them now. I wonder how you find yourself navigating your need to do different things in your writing in the same way you have a need to do different things in the world. You know, like for a long time, I felt like my writing went one direction. And even when I talked about the thing that is prison, I felt like I was incapable of recognizing that in prison, I cared about people. In prison, people took care of me. We laughed, we joked. And I wonder, as writers, have you had to grapple with what it means to make your work as expansive as you try to make your life, when sometimes your work is grappling with a really insular kind of problem that you only solve when you explode it and bring in those other elements of your life to it. I just wonder if you had to do that with your poetry.
Hmm. I mean, I don't know if this is an answer to the question, but maybe I hope. Um, no, I sometimes think because I guess I feel like sentence making is literally a way of finding a way forward and into clarity, into temporary clarity. And so to me, writing poems, I mean, and I don't feel that way when I'm driving around going for groceries, for example, but I do sometimes in the middle of the day think I'm doing what I do. I'm moving forward in my life as best I can and trying not to do any harm. And I hope help actually some people. And I feel like my poems are doing that too. So even though, because I worry that sometimes the poems are insular, but but then I think, no, there's still a way of trying to sort of stumble forward. And I think that's actually what it is to be human. You know, we look as if we're striding confidently forward sometimes. We're moving in whatever way we can forward, but that's not usually the case. And so it's almost like private and public. You know, there's the private world of the poetry, and then there's the public going into the daily community. But I think
Yeah.
that the gestures are the same for me.
No, it's beautiful actually, because everybody, the idea of sentence making being a way to think. I learned how to think actually. What I did in prison, because I had no choice, was to write letters. And the
Hmm.
very act of writing a letter was the act of constantly figuring out how to think. I'm talking about writing with an ink pen. You just had to figure out what it is that you wanted to say next. And most importantly for me, and this happened with poetry, I just had to fucking think and listen. In conversation, I'm not gonna lie, I'll bulldoze the person. I'll stop listening to them. I'll just wait to say something else. But the poem just demands that you listen to yourself and to go forward, it actually slows you down. And so that is a really good answer to my question, because maybe that's the way in which we get to what matters unintentionally. And that's why it's not propaganda and it's actually art.
Yeah, I love that it's not propaganda and it's actually art because I feel like, poetry is affective and effective. It's beautiful as language, but it's doing something in the world. And to keep both of those things happening, I think is what the hardest part of it is. And I don't know, I love that you read from your first book, Carl, because that's amazing. Like Reginald, I might be a little embarrassed to read from my first book, but at the same time, I feel like there is still the through line of humanity and some of the same concerns that keep following me throughout my life. And I think those are the same things the ways that we connect to the other people around us. So, yeah.
Okay, so would you put the poem on a t-shirt? Because Carl, I got some poems of yours, some lines that somebody told me that they wouldn't put a poem on a t-shirt. And I thought to myself, but if the poetry matters, why wouldn't you put it on a t-shirt? Especially if it's
Sure.
three lines, I mean, you got this haiku. So I wonder, I'm about to start putting my poems on t-shirts. I wonder, can I steal your lines and put them on t-shirts, Carl? That's what I'm gonna ask publicly right now. I don't
Sounds
want to
fine
get
with
sued.
me. I think that's better to spread the word. I also wanted to say that I guess I think because speaking of reading from a first book, I've never really I don't think of myself as having just books, but it's only like one long extended
Uh-huh.
record of what it's been to be this particular person, this particular body, and then it'll end. And
Mm.
I feel in that sense, I think the way that poetry connects with hope for me is one, just writing anything down means that this matters. If only to me, it has mattered. This is something that mattered this day. I saw this leaf fall at this time and I recorded it in some way. It doesn't have to always be a big, vulnerable revelation of something. And and I also feel there's a kind of hope because in writing something down, even if we aren't conscious of it, there's an implication that someone might find it. someone might see this one day. Not because we want to like be timeless and famous or something, but in the way that sometimes I'll just stumble upon like a grocery list, walking down a forest trail, and it's fascinating to me to think someone was planning something. They were making food for themselves, for a group of people, who knows? But it's also a record, even the handwriting. So someone was here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I once found a letter in the pocket of a airline seat,
Hmm.
and I never will forget it because it was a young woman writing to a man who was going into the service. She's professing her love and so forth. And apparently it had come to him on the plane and he had left it behind
Mm.
either because he forgot it and he's always longing for it or because he didn't care enough. But I
Mm.
had no way to find him. I just know that that's the kind of story, like that humanity of it, right? The longing of it and whatever that relationship is alive, in the writing. And,
I,
and it marks us, right?
it's
Hmm.
cool. Like just like that, I had a line that I wrote in prison, and it said something to the effect of, whatever he does when it leaves, it won't matter because success or failure, those who should see it most won't. And understand, I wrote this when I was like 20. And just this weekend, I thought I fucking lied to myself because I couldn't find it. And just this weekend, I found the poem. So I was like, I told y'all I wrote this. But the thing that's fascinating is like the poem and the writing actually, that was a really sorrowful, tragic line where I was predicting my inability to have a difference. And my whole life has been predicated on returning to prisons, on going back and like being the thing that people see for better or for worse. And I've gone back into prisons and like got banned from prisons for cursing. I've gone back into prisons and got applauded. But actually, I think what's fascinating is the act of writing it down gives you an opportunity to grapple with what it is that you're saying in ways that maybe you don't if you don't write it down. And maybe the writing it down allow, even if it's sorrowful, even if it's tragic, even if it seems to lack hope, writing it down might tell somebody, yeah, I'm gonna find hope in this. And it changes their disposition. Because I think when I wrote that, it became a challenge to myself that I've lived with. So maybe dude left that, but even him reading it, it became a challenge to who we want to, who he'll be in the world. And then you reading it, it becomes a challenge maybe to what it means to express love to somebody. I know I'm gonna write a love letter after this just because you read that story to me.
No, I just want to say, like, I had the opportunity and continue to have the opportunity to work in a prison. And um, my family have people who are in prison, my uncles, my cousins. It's not like I think that we all think of it such a distant place. But if you recognize the humanity in anybody, I'm always so moved by what the people write. And they're both, really powerful, but they're also funny. Like the name of the group that we work with is called Pros and Cons. So it's just, and like they'll invite us to their special events, and I just like blown away by how powerful people's words are. But it's like I feel like I see my relatives here. I mean, two steps away, it could have been me. You know what I mean? It's like in our society, we want to create such distance. And I think what poetry does is recognize the sort of humanity that we share. At least tries to, at least tries to make those connections.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Oh, it went a little silent because I keep thinking we're going to get interrupted and told to segue towards.
Is
I,
there a question we're supposed to take up? I don't
I
know.
don't know. Isabel, don't leave us stranded.
so I know we have 5 more minutes, and I think what happened
Okay.
is that, and I'm really excited about how people
You're
Oh, your
mute. You just muted yourself, Dwayne.
question.
There you go.
ask questions. People are engaging, and I was saying I've been reading the chat. It's been really fascinating, but I don't think people have actually been asking questions because I think they've been fascinated listening to the two of you. So I think that's it's been delightful.
Maybe to all of us. That you're amazing. Both of you. I just really want to say how grateful I am to spend this time with you.
I'm grateful as well, spending time with both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. This was an amazing conversation. I'm sure you all could have gone another hour. That was
There's lots to
wonderful.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a powerful, I feel like this conversation is being had at like the exact moment when people really feel the need to talk about this and hear your words. So thank you all very much for this evening. Everyone, this is on playback on YouTube slash NJPAC. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dwayne. Kimberly, Carl, what an amazing evening, and really appreciate you all for being so vulnerable and sharing your work.
Thank you. And thanks, Isabel. Thank
Appreciate you
you.
for having us and great to meet you guys. I just want to say
Yeah.
one more thing that I don't think we said at all, which is poetry isn't perfection. So anybody out there who has something to throw out into the conversation should totally do that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's what we all need. We need everybody throwing their voices into the poetry that we have.
Agreed.
Have a
Thanks,
good
everyone.
evening.
Okay. Thank you.